Elisabeth Rosenthal, thank you for coming on the Tailwind podcast to talk about your great book, which is called An American Sickness.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So I'm really excited to dive into it. The book focuses on the U.S. healthcare system and in particular, why we spend so much on healthcare in this country. But before we get to the book, could you tell us a little bit about your background and what you do now and why you decided to write this book?
Oh, sure. Where do I start? I trained as an ER doctor, but I'd always loved writing. I always thought that would be my side gig. So I practiced in ER and was New York Presbyterian in New York City. And, that was fun. I enjoyed that. But I was doing more and more freelance writing. And also in the emergency room, I was seeing, even then, many years ago, many things that really were dysfunction in our healthcare system rather than people's illnesses. And so when the New York Times came calling, because I'd done a lot of freelancing, they wanted someone to write about I'm going to sound like a real dinosaur now, the Clinton health reform effort. I was like, sure, I'll come do that. And, it'll pass and then I'll go back to being an ER doctor. But of course I didn't. I kind of got the journalism bug and also thought maybe I could do more writing about the system than dealing with it one patient at a time. And it's just kind of grown from there because I think all of the kind of tips of the iceberg of dysfunction that were apparent then, the icebergs are now like free floating and, crashing into each other. So then I went to the New York Times and covered a lot of different things, but mostly healthcare and environment. And even when I was in Beijing for a 6-year stint, that was SARS and rural AIDS and bird flu. So, I ended up doing healthcare reporting there, really. Then I covered environment for a while and was mostly in Europe and experienced a bunch of European health systems, right? So, I broke my hand in Sweden and went to a fancy doctor there and got it, x-rayed, cast, examined, the whole shebang for $400.
Wow.
I cut my forehead in Rome and, went to Gemelli Hospital. That's the Pope's hospital. So, the best. And got, 8 stitches in my eyebrow for, I think, 112 euros. So about $140. And then at some point I came back to the US and that was in 2007. And so I was away for 10 years. And in that period, the price of healthcare and the price of everything I encountered had just exploded, right? I use a Ventolin inhaler, albuterol inhaler, which was cheap when I left. And when I came back, it should have been off patent, but it was repatented and, much more expensive. All these basic antibiotics, which had cost not pennies, but, $10 were $200. And I was just like, oh my God, what has happened here? So, my editor at the Times, and when the ACA came up, said, or the editor-in-chief said, we want you to cover the ACA. And I said, God, I've already covered one health reform effort. What I want to cover is write a series about why everything costs so damn much in America. Like, what are we doing here? What happened? And that became a series called Pain Till It Hurts, which rolled out over 2 years. And, when that ended, I was like, damn, I still don't understand. Like, I understand there's this thing called the facility fee that makes colonoscopy so expensive. But how did we get this thing called a facility fee? I mean, when I would call, doctors in Europe and say, well, what's the facility fee for a colonoscopy? They would be like, what do you mean? Like, what's a facility? Like, the facility fees are an invention of the U.S. healthcare system. So anyway, that's what led me to say, bye-bye, New York Times. I want to write a book and really understand more about this. And that became An American Sickness, how healthcare became big business and how you can take it back. And I think how it became big business still to this day is very relevant. And there should be more chapters on like private equity explosion in healthcare. But how you can take it back, as some readers rightly noted, is just not sufficient for the size of the problem. So there are little things patients can do, and I laid them out, and there are things the government can do, and I laid them out, but mostly they're unable or unwilling to do. And so here we are, the book is now 7 years old. And it's like, my hope was, I'm going to write about this. Everyone's going to understand it and then it's going to be fixed and, it'll all be done. But, so anyway, after the book, I came down to edit what was then a very new startup newsroom called KFF Health News. It was then called KHN, which has been a wonderful experience. And now I'm a senior contributing editor there. So that's the long, short version of my life.
Well, thank you for that. And that's really important context, I think, as we dive into certain topics explored in the book. So to kind of just start at a high level, one of the things you talk about is that the economics of healthcare don't really follow sort of widely accepted economic theories that we see play out in other sectors. So could we start there? Could you describe how healthcare sort of defies some of the laws of economics that we've come to expect elsewhere?
Sure. I mean, I think the first one is we think competition will bring prices down. And we're going to set aside the hospital sector now because there isn't any competition there to speak of anyway. Right. But for things like drugs and generics, you think, that should bring prices down. But we see in so much of healthcare is this phenomena called sticky pricing, where a new entrant will enter into a field which you think, these 5 drugs for MS are competing with each other. And the new entrant will come in at a little higher price because they'll say, we have some studies showing it's once a month rather than every 2 weeks. And all the others will look around and go, wow, they got away with that. And they'll all rise their prices up to that high ceiling. So instead of prices coming down, we find them just going up and up and up. And even that happens it happens a little bit with hospitals too. In California, we have Sutter, which is a very expensive hospital system, as you probably know. And, someone said to me, Sutter sets the ceiling and all the other hospitals rise up to that ceiling because once they realize the other guy is getting away with it, they're like, we're suckers. Why would we compete? We want that pricing too. So what you end up with is everyone making a high price and no one having any real incentive to start a price war. And that's really the problem, right? There aren't any price wars. I mean, some researchers have said that you need 4 or 5 entrants into a drug class before you have competition. But there are drug classes where there are 10 options and there's still no real competition. So It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
And from a patient's perspective, even when insurance covers our entire bill, we're still paying for overpriced healthcare products and services in certain ways, right? And to what degree do you think people maybe don't fully internalize that? And that's maybe part of the problem and why reform has been somewhat insufficient?
Sure. I think part of the problem is that, most people are healthy most of the time, right? So, once every so often you get this bill, or more often you get an EOB from your insurer that will say, as in the case of my first colonoscopy, right? The hospital billed $12,000. We worked on your behalf to bargain it down to $9,000. And at the bottom is this happy, declaration, what you owe now, 0, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're not me, you're like, wow, I just dodged a bullet. If you're me, you say, oh my God, like $9,000 for a colonoscopy, that's bonkers. But, such is American healthcare. So yes, I think most people, when they look at these bills, they look at the top number and they go, oh, damn, that's a lot of money. And then they kind of look down and say, what you owe now. And as long as, you met your deductible or your out-of-pocket maximum, you're fine, basically. You owe nothing. And, this is changing somewhat as more people have high deductible health plans. But, I'm always impressed when I was looking through at KFF Health News, we do a project with NPR called Bill of the Month. And every once in a while, there was someone in Indiana, professor at Indiana University, whose kid got bitten by a rattlesnake. Her name was Oakley Yoder. And the bill was for treating her with antivenom was $150,000. Now, they didn't have to pay anything, but the dad, because he's a professor of health policy, sent us the bill saying, what is wrong with this system? How can we charge this much?
Right. And even when we're not paying anything, that top line number comes back to us often in the form of higher premiums the next year.
Oh,
And then
sure.
obviously, we're paying for it as taxpayers as well.
And not only in terms of higher premiums, it comes back to bite us in the way of higher co-insurance, more restricted networks. I mean, the insurers have many, many ways to keep their costs down. And if they pay out more, they find ways to give us less and have us pay more. And I think it's, many people are like, fooled. Oh, I dodged a bullet. Well, you want to know why your premium's going up, 7% next year, and your out-of-pocket max is going up $2,000 and your deductible up $1,000. That's why, because your insurer is paying these outrageous prices for you and other people in your plan. And I'm always surprised when states kind of pass these laws that say, well, premiums or a drug price can only go up, 10%. I'm like, if your rent went up 10% each year, everyone would be outraged. And somehow with health insurance, we all hate it. And no one likes the financial part of this healthcare system. But I think we all feel kind of helpless, like it's bigger than any of us. And as you said, the payments are often hidden, or the costs are often, we don't feel them as directly as we should, perhaps.
Right. So if someone goes to their doctor looking for something fairly routine, could be an EKG test, blood test, or an MRI, and before getting it, they ask the doctor how much it's going to cost.
Yeah.
Why is the doctor not able to give them a definitive answer?
Well, there are many reasons. Often it's because that actual cost is determined by a contract between your insurer and that particular provider. But with computers, you would argue that, well, they should just be able to put in my insurance and tell me, how much the contract is. But many of those contracts are secret. That's one thing we could ask for, right? But also, many doctors will say, the billing department of my hospital won't tell me. And I'm like, what do you mean they won't tell you? You're bringing in the business. But I think these costs are often hidden from a doctor, from the providers, so that they will just order this stuff. And that's not good. I mean, you can make broad generalizations like, okay, don't get that MRI or get that blood test run at a hospital, because that's going to be probably the most expensive lab to get it done at and the most expensive, radiology machine practice.
Right.
And in fact, I always say to my doctor, whose computer I'm sure is programmed to just order lab tests at the hospital where he practices, and I always ask him to send it to LabCorp instead, because I know it'll be a fraction of the cost. And P.S., once upon a time, we weren't paying a fraction of lab tests, but now we are. So, there are workarounds, but it's kind of insane to me that prices aren't on order sheets. When I talk to residents at hospitals, they all would like that, so when they check the box for like a CBC or PT, they'll know how much it's going to cost and think, do we really need that? I mean, my husband was in the hospital for a couple of weeks. They ordered a PTT every single day. I'm waiting to see the explanation of benefits, because that was not a test he needed even one day, probably, given what he was in for. But, it's just revenue generation. And a lot of times it's even worse than what you're asking about, because it's just like, check this one box to order all these labs instead of think about which of these labs you really need to know.
Yeah, and one of the solutions that you suggest in the book is to incorporate pricings or healthcare pricing into the medical training for doctors. And you point out that doctors are probably the best allies that patients have in sort of fighting the issues in our healthcare system. But they perhaps don't have the training. As you mentioned, sometimes they don't even have the information. But also, I feel like I would imagine on a day-to-day perspective, they're just thinking about how to make their patients healthy. They're not, the pricing is not as top of mind for them.
It's not, although there's certainly a growing consensus in oncology, especially that financial toxicity should be a consideration, right? That doctors should know these things. And, you don't want to say, oh, you're not going to get this treatment because it's too expensive. But I think a lot of what doctors do, and I did this, guilty as charged when I was an ER doctor, it's, why don't we just, that's to say, why don't we just order this scan just to, why don't we just give him some end plate? So I think knowing about price would end a lot of those, why don't we just orders that doctors do. But I think the other problem is doctors are stuck in this kind of hellish system with us, right? It takes a lot of fight to go to the billing office and sit there with your arms folded and say, I need to know the price of this MRI for this patient with this insurance, even though the billing office knows that and could make it readily available. They don't want to. So I think, doctors are busy and busier than ever because of the way insurance works now. They're mostly employed. And do they have time for this fight? Probably not. I mean, some do, and some call attention to it, but they're in the trenches every day. We just deal with it when we're sick, but they have to deal with this, broken system day after day. And it's very frustrating for them because they don't like it they don't like it when a patient comes back saying, oh, thank you for taking my appendix out. I feel much better, but now I'm bankrupt. That doesn't make any surgeon happy.
Right. So the main conversation in healthcare when I was growing up, I was in high school when the ACA was passed. And I had this impression that a lot of our problems in our healthcare system stem from insurance. And in reading your book, I've come to think that insurance, it's a part of the puzzle. But when you step back, while it's simpler to sort of pin the blame on any one stakeholder in the system, a big part of the problem is that we have so many different stakeholders and there's so many different layers in the system. And every one of those layers is sort of taking a cut.
Yeah. There are so many different kinds of players feeding at the trough of, American healthcare, and we're the food, basically. And as you mentioned, I think the layers and the players have only gotten more numerous, rather than less. So what you see in healthcare, which is so dysfunctional, and this is kind of how we got PBMs, right? There's the pharmaceutical manufacturers and the insurers, and they used to negotiate directly. And then this thing called a PBM comes in between and says, oh, we'll get you a better rate and we'll take part of the cut. And, then there's electronic health records, right? And that creates a new player that takes them. And then they're kind of clunky and don't work very well because they're basically billing tools. And then in between, like Epic and the hospital, there are layers of consultants who help hospitals make the EHR, better suit their needs. So there's an endless number of middlemen now that are all taking a percentage that to me, gosh, it should all be going to patient care. And I'm a little bit, opinionated on this. I'm not against capitalism per se, but I think there are so many people profiting off our health now. It's just disgusting. A lot of that money at least should be going to help people who are sick.
Let's talk about therapeutics. Why are drugs cheaper, like the exact same drugs, cheaper outside of the US?
Because every other country negotiates drug prices with manufacturers. It's a very straightforward answer.
Yeah. Is there an argument that Americans are sort of subsidizing a lot of drug research?
Possibly, but the studies on that suggest if we negotiated drug prices too, there might be, I don't remember the exact number, but it's like one less drug invented in the next, 30, 40 years. So, and no one's suggesting, that we pay bottom basement prices. Drugs are expensive everywhere to some extent, even in the other OECD countries, but nowhere like what we pay. And the real problem is so many of the drugs, and the FTC is starting to go after this, that are so expensive are not even that novel. They're more the kind of, Me Too drugs where you're not doing a lot of R&D to get to them. You're mostly seeing what someone else has done and figuring out a slightly different version of it, or their patent extensions, or what we're seeing a lot now, if you watch cable TV, are drugs for ultra rare diseases where the drug companies are taking advantage of FDA kind of promotions. Like you develop a drug for an ultra rare disease, it gets accelerated development. You actually get a coupon worth $100 million for, to help pay for your PDUFA fees, the fees that FDA charges. So do we get the drug? Do we get more drugs? Yeah, maybe, at the margins, particularly for very rare diseases. But, look at malaria, look at sickle cell disease, nothing. So I think, yes, you look at cancer drugs, amazing developments, but would those not happen if we just paid what other countries pay? I think they would happen just the same.
The topic of importing drugs is a controversial one from a couple different angles. There have been some legislative attempts at facilitating that flow. What do you think eventually happens here? I mean, just given that there have been legislative attempts from sort of higher profile lawmakers, do you think that there's eventually going to be some major changes there?
Well, I mean, the Biden administration has started Medicare drug price negotiation, which everyone thought was a non-starter 5 years ago. They've started it in a kind of slow and very tempered way. So, for those of us who've been railing against high drug prices, it feels like that's all. But it is an important, the dike has broken. Whether it will expand quickly or not, I think depends on the politics, right? And it's only for Medicare patients. So, great, they've capped insulin prices at $35 a month for insulin for Medicare patients, but not for all the young people who have type 1 diabetes. So what are you going to do about that? So, a lot of people take things into their own hands and buy drugs from Canada or from overseas. There are actually, bizarrely, laws in some jurisdictions in Florida facilitating that purchase for public employees. There are channels that the state has drawn to allow people to import drugs from overseas, which technically, and including Canada, the FDA would say is illegal, right? But they do it, so it's great. Civil servants breaking the law with approval. And then there's what you referred to, which are called margin rights, right? Which says, typically they've been used, and they've very, very rarely been used in the past, when there isn't a drug in the US that's available elsewhere in the case of some kind of public health emergency. So there wasn't a vaccine against meningitis B when there was a meningitis B outbreak on a few college campuses, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. So then they invoked margin rights and imported this vaccine from England, I believe. And, this also goes counter to the argument we always get drugs first, because this vaccine was available in England, it was available in Australia, it was available in Canada, but not in the US because there wasn't a business proposition. It's a rare, Men B is very rare, and so no one wanted to sell it here. But what politicians have now is a kind of novel application of margin rights saying, if a product is too expensive, we're going to allow for importation from overseas. It's, every senator has their own flavor of what we're going to do about drug prices. The problem is there's no consensus, and everyone is worried about, slippery slope. And of course, the biggest lobby in Washington is the pharmaceutical lobby. So that's a big problem too, of course.
One of the solutions you propose in the book is to have cost, or sort of like a cost benefit analysis, incorporated into the debate that the FDA does. It doesn't, the cost benefit analysis is not incorporated into whether or not the FDA ultimately gives it a green light, but it's at least a topic around the table. I believe the UK has a sort of separate entity that does something like that, right?
Yeah, the UK does do that. And if, there's a downside to it. If the UK decides the cost benefit isn't worth it to license that drug in the UK, it means if you're a cancer patient and you want to try it, it's not going to get covered. You're going to pay. So there is a price to that. But we do have a lot of drugs on the market that are not worth the cost that is charged for them. And there is a group in Boston called ICER, which does its own cost benefit analyses on certain drugs. It's an independent research group. And that's always interesting. And their conclusion is almost always that these drugs are not worth what we pay for them. But they do give some of them a pretty hefty price tag. And I guess the problem with cost benefit analysis too is, especially with our insurance system, is that most people change insurance every year or every 2 years. So insurers don't really care about the long-term cost benefit analysis, right? You say, oh, if there's this drug for which there are miraculous drugs for hemophilia now, right? But they're hugely expensive, $1 million a year. If you're an insurer, like if you're not going to insure that person for a lifetime, you don't care what the cost benefit analysis is. So, having the FDA incorporate cost benefit analysis is understandably, I think, fraught, but I do think it's somewhat insane that they don't have any idea of the cost that's going to be charged when they approve a drug. And they're almost always shocked. They're like, yeah, I mean, you speak to people on the advisory committees who vote to approve license of pharmaceutical, and then they see the cost and they're like, wow, it's not worth that. So I think at least some commitment to what the cost will be is worthwhile. The problem is the FDA follows the FDA's mandate, which is very narrow, and its approvals are based on the FDA determining that a drug is safe and effective. Is it worth it? Not, that doesn't enter into the equation. Even how effective doesn't enter into the equation. So, they have this, many FDA committees talk about non-inferior. They don't even have to show a drug is better than
Right.
what's on the market. They just have to show non-inferiority, which I don't even know if it's a word in English, but it's a word at the
Not
FDA.
sure either. Yeah. So your book came out, I think the first edition came out in 2017, and then there was a second one that came out in 2018. So I'm curious, how do you think we're doing? How do you think America is doing at this since the book came out?
Not great is the short answer. I think we've seen more consolidation in the healthcare system, much more than I ever imagined, with these huge hospital networks that have near monopoly power. I mean, I wrote about it in the book, but it's just gotten way worse over time because, there's blame to go around, but the FTC, the new FTC under Lena Khan, has been very active in trying to block hospital consolidation, but the horse may be out of the barn on that one. So, it's all kind of just happened. Also, there are a lot more layers, some of which we talked about that I hadn't seen. I would add another chapter about hospital consolidation. I would add another chapter about private equity, but so it's gotten worse in many ways. It's gotten worse to a point where some of the suggestions in the book, I'm glad at least we've developed a kind of solution for them, like the No Surprises Act, like the surprise billing thing. I had an inkling of it, but it got so much worse in the 10 years since the book came out, or the 8, 9 years. Oh God, I'm really bad at math. It's 7 years. Anyway, so there was the No Surprises Act, but what we've seen from the business of healthcare is, it's very agile. It's found a lot of ways to get around the No Surprises Act
Right.
because the No Surprises Act says patients can't be held responsible, but it doesn't say that providers can't try to bill. And, if patients get a bill saying, you owe $500, they're mostly going to pay it if they have the money. So the No Surprises Act, the beginning of Medicare drug price negotiation, that's good. A lot of states are experimenting with drug pricing boards. That's good. I think it's kind of reached a point of intolerability for many people. And I don't understand exactly. I think it's what you talked about earlier, though, why it isn't more of a political issue. I know, abortion is part of the election this year, a big part, understandably. But, if people want to know why they don't feel better off, I'm screaming like, it's your healthcare costs, it's your healthcare costs. Like, it's not really the price of gasoline, which is really visible, but it's the healthcare costs that you just are mostly hidden from you.
Right.
So, I think sadly it's gotten worse. Are we at a tipping point where it's going to start getting better? Maybe. That's my hope. But, I'm still banging my head against the wall trying to talk about these things in the hopes that there will be a solution. And, it doesn't have to be, it will be an American solution. It's not going to be like the NHS, or it could be more like Switzerland or Germany, where there are a lot of insurers, but they're much more regulated, and the insurers won't like that, right?
Right.
Do you want? They won't like that at all. So, in those places, there are a lot of insurers, but they can't be for profit. So, how's Cigna? How are you going to like that? Not very much. So,
Mhm.
profit is the basis of our healthcare system, but it's, everyone squawks a lot about too much regulation. And I like to say, yeah, there's too much regulation, but it's regulated in the wrong ways. We don't regulate prices or the insurance plans on the market very well. I mean, you go on the ACA marketplaces, and someone said to me, like, good plans hidden in a kind of sea of bad options. And no one says, wow, that's not a plan you should be allowed to sell in our state. So there's things we can do, and states are starting to do them. Some are starting to experiment with a public option, which, the Dems have promised, I think, for every election until this one, where healthcare's out of the, kind
Yeah,
of
it
out.
is out of the, yeah.
So I'm always optimistic that something better will happen. I feel really lucky. I have good health insurance, but I feel really sad that so many people are stuck, sick, and worried about the finances of it all rather than their illness.
I am cautiously optimistic as well. I mean, I think part of it is what I see is I'm exposed to a lot of innovation, particularly around care delivery and people being able to receive care at home and in more
Yeah.
convenient ways that I think would just kind of reduce the sort of total overhead of providing care. And that could bring costs down over time. That's where I spend most of my time in terms of kind of the types of companies we work with. And there's some exciting things happening there, but
Yeah, I mean, home infusions, full on hospital at home. There are great opportunities there. The question is, will some of that cost saving be plowed back into healthcare, or will it just go to the entrepreneurs who set up the hospital at home system? And I think that's always or the, president of the hospital, you just don't know where is the money going and where's the money saved going. So yeah, I think there are a lot of innovations that could help, but they're in that little part of the Venn diagram, and how to separate those truly good innovations, I mean, in the way of good for patients, and, that may make money for someone, that's fine, from the bad ones that will just, get VC funding and really won't be good for anyone, but will sound good.
right. It's important that people are in the types of roles that you're in. So there's someone there tracking it and sort of, taking note of all that as money flows through the system. But I know that we're over time right now, and I'm really grateful that you would come on to talk about this book. And yeah, like I said, I'm cautiously optimistic that things will get better. And thank you again. This has been great.
Thank you. I hope you find some good innovation to fund because
Thank you. Yeah.
we
Yeah. I
need it.
appreciate it.
Take care. Bye-bye.